Hello again. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is the greatest intellectual descendant of Immanuel Kant. But that's not to say that he was in any way the earlier philosopher's supine follower. He took over and appropriated thoughts and themes in Kant's work, while giving them his own distinct spin, which was really quite revolutionary in its day, and were it to be understood today, in ours. Hegel is the consummate philosophical systematizer. He thought, in fact, that the cosmos itself, all of reality, was identical in some important way with the proper, that is, his own philosophical system. Now, occasionally, in the history of thought, it happens that what seems to be an acute case of megalomania turns out to be a very important philosophical insight. And in Hegel's case, this very well may be true. I won't go much into his larger system. Here in this lecture, I really want to focus on two crucial aspects of his thought that are of really direct pertinence for us. First, his understanding of the origin of evil for the individual and what he saw as its mythological formulation in concepts such as original sin, much as Kant did. And then second, and far more revolutionary and quite different from Kant, actually, his assessment of the overall place of evil and role it plays in history considered as a whole. When we think about Hegel, we think about him as someone who takes a very philosophically dense take, a construal of history. And in fact, we will see that it is precisely around the problem of evil that Hegel's historical philosophizing is most profound. Hegel was born in 1770 and died in 1831. So he didn't live as long as Kant, and he was a young man when Kant was at his magisterial prime. In his student days, he was very close friends with the poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. In fact, they were roommates together, I believe in Tübingen in Germany. As a professor at Jena, at the University of Jena, which is a city in Germany, in 1806, he was finishing up his first and in some ways most important masterpiece called The Phenomenology of Spirit. And it was in Jena in 1806 that Napoleon was about to fight an enormous battle with a series of royal armies that were aligned against him. And famously, Hegel, sitting in his study in Jena, doing some final edits and corrections on the manuscript of Phenomenology of Spirit, at one point looks out his window down to the street below and sees Napoleon riding by with his retinue. And he had a thought that he reports to a friend in a letter later. He says, "I saw the world spirit outside my window." It's an incredible moment. Hegel thought that the writing of the Phenomenology of Spirit was an event not just of philosophical importance for the world. It was a moment in which the world would come to understand itself in a new and far more profound way. And thus, in his writing of this, he was rendering intelligible the meaning of the world through the story of its history up to that moment. For Hegel, in some sense, the point of the world was to come to self-consciousness. We'll see about this in a second. And to come to self-consciousness is to understand what it has been trying to become all along. Hegel, at his desk, there, looking out the window, sees what he takes to be the world spirit, that is, the central place in the material world, the axis, the spot in matter, namely the person of Napoleon, where the world spirit is most acutely working itself out, creating the conditions for its own self-realization as time goes on. And yet, Hegel also says, I, writing at my desk, am the one who knows what's actually going on there. So Hegel actually thinks of himself in the activity of writing the Phenomenology of Spirit as more important for the history of humanity and the world than Napoleon, because Napoleon is only acting It is Hegel who will eventually provide the understanding of what Napoleon's actions mean. That's what I mean about megalomania. But it's also, again, it's very, very acute because Hegel wasn't entirely wrong. He, in fact, did have a kind of understanding that would be important in ways, definitely, you could argue, rivaled Napoleon's importance over the history of the next several centuries. Eventually, Hegel becomes the professor of philosophy, the professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin, which is the central German university of the age. He enormously influences a generation of students and creates rival schools of Hegelianisms, counter-Hegelianisms, quasi-Hegelianisms. And he dies there during a cholera epidemic, though we don't think was cholera itself, in 1831. Now again, there's a lot of different and important things to talk about when it comes to Hegel. I really just want to talk about two here. One is his construal of the meaning of original sin and the nature of evil for humans. The other is how he understands the course of history to be a working out of a certain solution to the problem of evil. Let me focus on the first here, Hegel, on the doctrine of original sin, both because of what its interest in itself, and also because of how it shows us something important about Hegel's understanding of how to think about philosophical concepts. So, the Enlightenment rejects the doctrine of original sin. We saw this with the hostility to Kant on radical evil, because it finds, Hegel thinks, the form in which it is taught, the doctrine is taught, incredible, literally unbelievable. It's presented, Hegel says, as an external force outside of the self, infecting the self from Satan via the apple, and also hereditary, a biological transmission in some sense. So the Enlightenment thinks of this as primitive, naive, unscientific, and simply not true. But Hegel, following Kant, insists that there is something to the doctrine, something the doctrine captures, even as it has been traditionally misunderstood. For him, the true meaning of the doctrine is missed in the confusions on its surface. The reality is that, and he thinks this is really important, the fact of human thinking itself, human subjective self-consciousness, is the origin of the knowledge of good and evil, and thus of original sin. Original sin, then, is a consequence of human reflection, human reflexivity. Now, what does that mean? Human reflexivity is the ability humans have to step back and think about themselves as they are doing something. After all thinking is, in some sense, a form of stepping back from a situation and reflecting upon it from a sufficient distance to not be caught up in its immediate, imminent tumult. Thinking, that is, naturally estranges us from our immediate situation. We become self-conscious, and self-consciousness is kind of a form of self-estrangement for Hegel. It's kind of a form of sin. Now, it is this way because humans, in being self-conscious, are effectively rendering themselves available to themselves as objects of thought. To so render yourself available to yourself as an object of thought is, in some sense, to lose your original organic integrity. That's all Hegel means there, all right? The loss of that original organic integrity, the loss of the ability to be in the moment, is, for Hegel, sin. Now, that's not the only part of this. It's also the case that Hegel says the doctrine of original sin says that humans are, in some sense, by nature, evil. That is, it somehow is constitutive of the structures of human existence as a whole, at least as we find them. Now, many figures in the Enlightenment, many thinkers in the Enlightenment, dismiss this view by suggesting that it's far too pessimistic. And Hegel agrees. If we think of nature as fundamentally static, but the deep insight of the statement that humans are constitutively sunk in evil, in some sense, Hegel thinks, is that, in fact, and as all should be able to recognize, human beings are not what they ought to be, he says. Humanity is clearly at odds with the world and its true nature. The formulation of original sin, in any of the various religious formula it's offered in, may be stale or mythological, but the insight being communicated, Hegel thinks, is quite profound. For we do, in fact, exist in a state of inevitable and, at present, inescapable estrangement from the world, and from ourselves. We know this because we are all able to watch ourselves act in the world. Again, we have reflexivity. We've all had the experience of not being fully in a moment, both being in it and not in it, just because when we see ourselves acting in that moment, just to the extent that we are watching ourselves, we are not in that moment. In fact, you can sometimes have the experience of noticing yourself not being in the moment. That is, you can sometimes have the experience of noticing yourself as you try to exist in the moment. That is, you're not only a double self then, you have somehow segmented yourself off again and are now watching yourself, right? In fact, that's bottomless. That kind of radical self-consciousness for humans, Hegel thinks, is bottomless. And that is a crucial fact about us as creatures, and it's a crucial intuition that the doctrine of original sin is trying to convey. The fall is the rupture of pure, unself-conscious identity into a split awareness, however multiply split that awareness may be, a sense of alienation and loss. And that's formulated as evil, but also and simultaneously, it brings with itself, as its necessary consequence, an awareness of the lost status as one that was good. So sin is not only an experience we experience in itself, it also gives us a kind of nostalgia for an Edenic earlier state. That's original sin. And yet, Hegel thinks, this is a kind of felix culpa, right? A happy fault. For it is a necessary fact for our maturation as self-conscious agents, an inevitable stage. Again, call it the awkward self-conscious teenager stage, in our progress towards what Hegel sees as our final situation of complete self-consciousness, which is somehow also returned to a complete absorption in the context in which we find ourselves. What this endpoint is tremendously obscure in Hegel. It involves the complete harmony of the person and the activity they are involved in, but all of that taken back into the mind so that the mind is fully aware of what's going on, and in some sense, the mind appreciates what's going on even as it is engaged in it. I mean, the only examples that I can point to, and I've thought about this a lot, it's hard to actually imagine, as it should be because we're all caught in this now, Hegel thinks, except for a few very graceful moments, we're all caught in this alienation. The only examples I can think of here that even gesture at what Hegel is trying to get at, it seems to me, are the examples of certain masters of particular skills. Athletes, musicians, race car drivers, dancers or actors, maybe novelists when they are actively writing and typing furiously on the computer or the keyboard. They're people whose actions are both completely automatic and natural and thoroughly saturated with a serious thinking through of the situation. Now, this gives us a glimpse of what Hegel means, but only a glimpse. Again, we can't fully know what this condition of reconciled harmony will be like from outside of it, because it's like attempting to describe what our lives will be like when they have been so reconciled, which they, manifestly have not been yet. The individual subject's will, the subject's capacity to assert itself, its capacity for freedom, that is both the problem and the potential for the problem's ultimate, what Hegel calls sublation, that is, the problem's ultimate resolution in a higher synthesis. And that gives us some intuition of what Hegel's own vision of history is about, and how history is itself, Hegel will say, the working out of the meaning of the problem of evil in time. Now, the story of history for Hegel, on one level, is about the human intellect coming over many generations into its maturity through its struggle to understand history, to understand the story of its own development. There's another level we'll get to in a minute, a kind of more theological level, but focus on this one here. In other words, the human comes to grow up as a species, not just an individual, but as a species, precisely by reflecting on history and coming to see what it means. Now, this picture is more philosophically contested than it may at first appear. It assumes that history itself is rational. That is, that history actually means something that we can understand and render intelligible to ourselves and to one another. History is an activity or a process, but it is in part a process driven forward itself by people attempting to discern just what that process means. History, that is, considered as a whole, is an ongoing intellectually, an ongoing intellectual inquiry into the shape of the meaning of what it is to be human through interpreting the events that we undertake and that things that happen to us as an ongoing practice of questioning and finding answers for what this means. Now, this means that the very activity of questioning itself shapes the events that come after that questioning in certain ways. The U.S. Civil War, for example, is itself not just a dumb event. It is, in a complicated way, an intellectual event. It's an attempt, in part, by the two sides, the two bodies of competence, to understand the meaning of the American Revolution, as people on both sides of that war recognized. The Civil War was an intellectual struggle as much as it was a military struggle. And that's why someone like Abraham Lincoln could write in, 600 or 700 words in the Gettysburg Address, a speech, again, of 600 or 700 words, that was probably more powerful for determining the outcome of that war than any numbers of battles would have been. History unfolds, and the mind matures. This is a kind of the basic philosophical presumption of the story here. History unfolds and the mind matures in a dialectical relationship. Each new event in history shapes our minds in a new way. And the minds, our minds, so newly shaped, in turn shape the new history in new ways as well. It's like a dance in which each partner's next step is new, but responds to the other partner's immediately previous step. History and the human intellect play a game of back and forth, where each in turn sharpens and focuses the picture that they are coming mutually to represent. Now, this may all sound kind of crazy. It may seem odd to call history intelligible, something so vast and complicated. How can it be intelligible? Well, the truth about Hegel is that Hegel sometimes can make things sound really profound that on one level are actually really obvious. On another level, on Hegel's level, they are really profound, but on a basic level, actually, what he's saying is really obvious. Every time we try to understand history, every time we try to make sense of history, every time we tell a story about what happened, and we leave some things out and keep some things in, highlight some things, downplay other things, we are implying that there is some real story, there is some sense to be made about our past. On one level, then, Hegel is clearly right. Anthropologically, ethnographically, we do this all the time. We do believe history is intelligible. Now, others might challenge our confidence or conviction about this, but their challenge is far deeper than it may at first appear. It's not a challenge to an abstruse philosophical idea that history must be somehow meaningful. It's a challenge to the very idea that when we tell stories about history, we are finding meaning in it, right? In other words, Hegel is offering as a very philosophically significant point something that actually on some level looks like a commonplace. And I'm not saying this is a criticism of Hegel, I'm saying that in some important way, he's grabbed onto something philosophically very profound that we do all the time, though we never noticed how profound it was. That in itself would make Hegel a really worthwhile philosopher to think about. But then, Hegel goes on to make a more audacious claim even than that, and one that it is significantly easier for us to dissent from. Many people have dissented from it without much trauma intellectually, other than Hegel. He says that history is not only the human mind coming to understand itself. More than that, more deeply than that, more truly than that, the human mind itself is involved in a much larger working out of something far more vast than merely the human, namely, what Hegel thinks of as God's unfolding self-understanding. That is to say, for Hegel, reality itself is essentially rational, and the core of history is an intelligible story, not just of how the human is coming to know itself, but how the world's spirit is coming to know itself, and know itself as free, that is, as having chosen over many thousands of years this course of history, however filled with evil and mysterious suffering, mysterious at the time that it may be. And the Spirit chooses this history as the story of its own slow realization of its own power. Now, this representation of God, this story of what Hegel calls the world spirit, means that God is actually using the whole of history and human attempts to understand history to make sense of itself, of this God. History, then, is the dialectical process, again, the back and forth process of spirit coming to full self-awareness, working out the explicit knowledge of what it had potentially been all along in the material events of the history of the human race and the history of the world as a whole. So Hegel's first book, which was called The Phenomenology of Spirit, that's why it's called that, because it's about the structures of the logic of history understood as the working out of the thinking of spirit, absolute spirit in history. This may sound very abstract. In fact, I know it sounds very abstract. It sounds very abstract to me. But what Hegel is trying to get at is really something important here. Most fundamentally, we are bit players in Hegel's view, in a history far greater than we can presently properly comprehend. Well, a history that most of us can presently properly comprehend. I mean, Hegel seems to be able to comprehend it pretty well. And that may sound presumptuous, and I'm sorry for being a little snarky there, but Hegel actually means it quite seriously. And he takes as his model the individual human's maturation and uses that to explain what he's talking about. When you were a child, you acted in certain ways, and certain things happened to you, and you didn't quite understand what was going on. But as an adult, you can look back on your childhood, and you can now see it as a process, only dimly understood at the time that it was happening, of your coming to a mature, self-conscious possession of yourself as an adult. Or maybe at least what we hope to be mature, self-conscious possessions of ourselves. I mean, for most of us, I think that's more of an aspirational ideal. For myself, it's more of an aspirational ideal than a concretized, realized goal, right? But in some sense, the story of our childhood into adulthood is a story of our growing ability to understand ourselves, to decide for ourselves what we want to do, and to be able freely and responsibly to decide not just what we want to do, but who we want in some sense to be. Hegel thinks the world itself is also in this process of maturation. In fact, Hegel thinks it's quite near its completion. One of the signs that we are getting near the completion of this process is that the intellect of Hegel has come along to help us see that the final stages are beginning to be set. Now, this all means that in Hegel's view, history has a certain telling that makes sense. And that telling is in some sense a rational telling. It's an intelligible telling. History, in its most real, is intelligible. As Hegel famously says, what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that is right. Pope's line, right? At least it doesn't mean that in the sense that everything that is must be at all times approved of, that resistance to anything is always wrong. That's not what Hegel means. History's course is necessary in some sense for Hegel, though it's not a terrifically narrow sense of necessity. The future is not now and will never be absolutely predictable, as if it were a really good, as if we had a really good sort of meteorology of the spirit. Hegel and astrologers such as Nostradamus are doing very different things in their work. Our resistance to what we don't want to happen in history, Hegel says, is as much a part of history's rationality as the things that we don't want to happen are. Disease is a part of history, and it's real. But inoculations are a part of history too. And in some ways, perhaps, the disease is more real only insofar as it prompts the inoculations. Indeed, sometimes, in fact, what looks like resistance to inevitability actually has the future on its side. Sometimes adversity turns out to strengthen the weak and make them ultimately come out on top. Consider one historical phenomenon. The Black Death, which we saw, may have killed half of Europe, created the conditions, as I suggested also, for the Reformation 200 years later. A thing that can devastate a culture, a civilization at one moment, may in fact surprisingly turn out to enable that culture to survive and prosper in other ways in the future. This is what Hegel calls the cunning of reason. Reason is cunning, it's crafty, it surprises us all the time. But still, Hegel thinks, even though reason is cunning, it can only be so cunning, and there is the possibility of discerning a shape and purpose to history. At least Hegel thinks so. And reason's aims will inevitably be accomplished, no matter what. But we can't always, at the moment, tell just what reason is meaning to do. All we know is that in the end, it will make sense. In fact, it will make the only sense there could be. Now, all this means that in some sense, things that are not as central to the story that it ultimately means to be telling, those things will not have the big role in history that they may seem to at the moment that we experience them. History, thus, can be said to be providentially governed, and the true philosophy of history will be, for Hegel, also and simultaneously, as he says, a theodicy, a justification of all the suffering that has happened. Because evil is so deeply irrational, we must figure out why there is evil in the world. And Hegel thinks his philosophy of history is an account of why. In fact, he says very frankly that his account is a theodicy, a justification of the ways of God. But this is not the kind of theodicy that Leibniz offered or that Pope poeticized, which was mechanical and static, saying that all was as harmonious as a well-functioning watch. Hegel has a more organic and developmental understanding of evil. He begins with the idea of divine providence, but once he adopts a view of God as immanent in human history, as directly governing the forces of human history, and in some ways coming to understand itself in human history, the only conclusion left is that events that are real are justified precisely because they are necessary. The Lisbon earthquake, devastating as it was a necessary part of the world spirit's coming to know itself. The world spirit's advance towards full and complete self-consciousness. In this case, in part, because of the corrective prompt it gave to overly simple optimistic thought about evil in the Enlightenment. The people who died in the earthquake were kind of the unfortunate byproduct of that. But the true meaning of the event was to shock thinkers about evil, on some reading of Hegel, anyway. Furthermore, whereas previous attempts to develop a philosophical theodicy aimed at reconciling humans to the existence of evil, Hegel doesn't do that. He believes that there cannot be any absurd remainder to reality, any kind of postulated body of evil stuff that exists alongside the real story. So he has to show that evil is not really ultimately evil at all. In fact, he has to show that the world is as it ought to be in all its essential rational details. Concrete evils happen, that is, as part of the unfolding of the logic of history. But they're finally justified by the course of history, and in that justification, they turn out never to have been evils at all. Now, all this should be vaguely reminiscent of Irenaeus. Irenaeus of Lyon, remember? The early Christian theologian who we heard about in another lecture. And as we saw, Hegel himself recognized that this is a theodicy, and a theodicy that justifies evil by claiming it is necessary and productive of a better future for us. Now, on some readings of Hegel, some people confuse him, or accuse him, I should say. They accuse him of being conservative or even authoritarian. I don't think the problem with Hegel is that he's an authoritarian. In important ways, he's not. He's a progressive. He's in certain ways a kind of modern political individualist in some ways. The problem with Hegel, at least as I read him, is that he is inescapably and inevitably parochial. Does the method demand that anyone who employs it be parochial? In other words, if you actually think that you've unlocked the key to history, does your understanding inevitably reveal your understanding itself to be narrow and not able to see the whole story? Because Hegel himself would assume that there could have been other people who had some of the thoughts he had at previous moments in history who were just wrong because they hadn't seen the whole history. Perhaps the same thing could be said of Hegel himself. In any event, Hegel offers us no powerful counterexample to this charge. Hegel's also criticized for being sometimes overly optimistic. But this is only because he takes our ambition to understand with mortal seriousness. And I think that that's an ambition that we must prove in the end to be correct. Hegel's account, that is, suggests that if we cannot understand evil, we will find that we are not the thinking creatures we take ourselves to be, and that history is not the intelligible process that we take it to be. Now let's just wrap this up for the moment. It's possible after this lecture and the previous one to offer a kind of mutual critique of Kant and Hegel. Hegel can critique Kant by postulating only a transcendent hope, a hope that somehow is inchoate but present in the will. Kant, Hegel says, you deflate energies we might have for improving and working on the world here and now. We need more than faith that things will ultimately be made eventually right. We need to know that we can contribute to their becoming right in history. But Kant can also critique Hegel. Hegel, Kant would say, by suggesting that reality is all you know, you are demanding that we accept completely everything that happens as what it means to be happening as. And that strikes me, Kant is saying to Hegel here, that strikes me as cultivating a kind of resignation that is profoundly antithetical to what the human actually is in their free will. We'll see this debate between one group of people arguing that evil needs to prompt us to be more active, and another group of people arguing that evil needs to prompt us to be more reflective about how we understand history itself, as carrying on in the many next lectures we'll be having, because this debate carries up even to today. In the next lecture, though, I want to turn to Hegel's most influential descendant, who is, indisputably, Karl Marx.